Hello, this is Chris Benson, and I'll be presenting locating a practice, associateship, or purchase opportunity to you over the next hour. It's a privilege to be part of this presentation group, and thank you for joining. My name is Chris Benson. I've been working with the orthodontic community for over 23 years. I currently serve as president and managing partner of Benson Clark & Koppel, LLC. We're located in Greensboro, North Carolina, and work exclusively with orthodontists on any change of ownership need. We provide valuation, transition, and partner location services to orthodontist owners within the United States. And I also serve as editor-in-chief of the Benson Clark Resource. It's a subscription-based quarterly newsletter that's focused on the business aspects of running a successful orthodontic practice. Hopefully you've received some copies of that throughout your program years. During the last 23 years, I've had the opportunity to visit personally over 1,000 orthodontic practices within the United States, Canada, and also Australia. And enjoy speaking and had the opportunity and privilege to speak at various society, regional, and AAO component meetings. So it's a privilege to speak with you tonight about a topic that hopefully is very salient and has to do with getting out of school and getting into the working world. This program is generously sponsored by G-Care, which is a Dentsply sponsored clinical education program. This specific topic tonight is geared towards the orthodontic resident community and will focus on locating potential practice opportunities. The goal of this webinar is to discuss general topics that are relevant to residents, including ways to polish your CV, provide some industry resources for locating a practice opportunity, and to discuss different types of practice transitions. Also share some tips on how to analyze practice profit and loss statements, financial data, and some ways to look at overhead and evaluate opportunities that hopefully will be helpful to you. So we're going to talk about transition, and it can mean a number of things, but you see the definition here. It's a passage from one state or place to another, and the passage we specifically want to talk about tonight is the passage from being a resident or a young associate to an owner of a practice. And so you're well schooled in your courses in the clinical field. You spend most of your time during your program honing that skill. And what I want you to do is take off your clinical hat right now and put on this kind of virtual business owner hat and start thinking as the CEO or head of a small business, which will be your orthodontic practice. The first thing we want to talk about as we think about that idea is who should I surround myself to help ensure my success. And while it doesn't take a village, it does take a certain number of people that each can provide specific information to you and advice to you as a business owner. And so this is you sitting at your virtual boardroom, and what I want to spend a few minutes doing is discussing who would be a good team of people to surround yourself with that will give you the highest level of opportunity to be successful as you enter into practice ownership. The first person we think you should consider is an orthodontic mentor, and these come in different varieties. It may be a classmate that you've gone through your program with. It may be the senior doctor from whom you're buying the practice. It may be a good friend in another program that you've been in touch with. It may be an orthodontist in a study club in a nearby town. But this is someone that over your career you're going to develop a relationship with and be able to talk, besides clinical cases, with various business decisions, like you're having a specific human resource problem with a staff member, or you want to consider making an investment in a building, or you need some demographic analysis, or you've got a new competitor, and how do you structure your marketing to best attack that specific issue that you're trying to tackle. An orthodontic mentor is necessary and should be part of your team. Probably one of the first professionals that are critical to your success is your CPA. And we would advise you not necessarily to choose the senior member in the largest CPA firm in the town you choose to practice in, but interview some people, decide who you have some chemistry with, include your spouse in the discussion in the meetings, and maybe find someone who's just a few years older than you are, but that you can grow with through your career. So the senior partner is not retiring as you get into some critical points and you have to establish a new relationship. But you'll need to hire a CPA. They'll help you with your taxes. They'll help you structure your business corporately. They'll give you key advice on how to keep more of what you make. An attorney is someone that will be in your life from time to time, but isn't necessarily going to be part of every decision that you make. You certainly will need an attorney as you purchase a practice to help you through the legal documents, the leases, those kinds of things, and the language in that can be foreign to you. And you'll need an attorney if you bring in an associate. You'll need an attorney if you sell a practice. So it's good to establish a relationship with an attorney in your town that understands good business contract law. From time to time, you'll need an insurance advisor, and you'll see that it's kind of muted, the title. You won't need an insurance person all the time. Certainly as you start your career, there are many types of insurance products besides life insurance that will be important to you. Things like malpractice and liability insurance, practice overhead insurance, disability insurance. That's one young orthodontists frequently think they can get to later, and sometimes later never gets here. So it's an important area to get some advice on. There's a suite of products that you'll need to be educated about and decide on. And we think the AAO-IC, the AAO-sponsored insurance company, is a great place to start for your basic practice liability insurance, and they can advise you on places to go for the other types of insurance that you'll need to consider. But we do see many young orthodontists kind of not go all in with the insurance products that they need to have for the protection of their family. And it's important to understand how insurance can help you, especially in your early years. And ideally, you'll work to be financially independent and not need to have the kind of and amounts of insurance that you will when you're young. Your local banker, we do a lot of online banking, all of us do these days, and so that relationship with a local bank is becoming diminished, but we think it's still important, especially if you choose to practice in a more suburban or rural area. Being able to walk into a bank where you make your deposits and have a relationship with the senior members of that bank is important. They will help you with, besides accepting your deposits and helping you earn a little bit of interest on what you have, and they'll help you with buying things like homes, boats, second homes, some of the fun things that you'll have a chance to do as an orthodontist. So having a relationship with a local banker we think is critical. Next, we have practice management or practice consultant slash wealth manager. And if I could encourage you to do any one thing as a young owner of an orthodontic practice, it would be to start earlier with a practice consultant or practice consultant group, and also start as early as you can with a sophisticated wealth manager that will help you make smart decisions with some of the money that you're going to earn. These early years are hard to recapture, and while you do have significant, some of you, educational debt, and you'll have some significant debt as you enter and purchase a practice, you will also be cash flowing and able to save some money, and starting early is going to be critical to your financial success, more so for you in your generation of orthodontics than perhaps past generations. So it's important to have these people. I often tell residents that they have $1 to spend on their practice, where would they spend it? I ask the question, and I suggest that if you spend it on a practice consultant versus a new digital x-ray machine or a new laser device that can do some procedures, or the next newest, greatest thing, that if they spend that with a practice consultant, the return on that dollar will be many times return versus any other place you could spend money, and you'll have the money to buy some of that fun stuff if you have great systems. And that's one of the secrets of building a great practice, is to have great systems. And practice consultants bring with them this idea of transferable concepts, things that they know that work, that you can transfer from one practice to another almost regardless of location. You don't have to eat and believe everything you hear from every practice consultant, but you can learn from all of them. And the orthodontic community has been very generous, and there's a great number of fantastic practice consultants that can help you build great systems which will enable you to build wealth and have a less stressful life and a happier business experience. So have a practice consultant and wealth manager around your boardroom table. A transition advisor is going to be necessary probably only twice in most of your careers. That'll be as you enter a practice and as you exit your practice. But if you grow an enterprise and decide that you want to bring on partners or associates, which many young doctors are doing in this environment, expanding your footprint, you'll need the advice of a transition advisor to help you along the way. And so that person will come and go as well. And lastly, if you're married, we think your spouse is a fabulous team member on your board of directors. They know your gaps. They know what you don't see. They know you better than sometimes you'll admit to, and they can be great sounding boards for big decisions. And so including them in these decisions, not necessarily having them work in the practice, but including them in these decisions and the people that are helping advise you is a wise thing to do. So this is just an idea of who to surround yourself with. We see practice owners that surround themselves with great advisors seem to have bigger practices, seem to have a better practice lifestyle, seem to have less stress, happier staff, and seem to perform well on almost every measurable financial and operational metric that we see during the valuation and transition process. So what kind of opportunities are available for you as you exit your program? This is a list that was put together by Dr. Bob Scholes, and he presented this at GORP several years ago, and I think it's a good list, so I wanted to share it with you. It's not exhaustive. There's a few other places you can land, but just briefly to go through these, you can start up on your own. Only about 11% of you do that. We'll see that statistic later on in a slide. But if you know where you want to be and you can't find something to buy, we think there's room for everybody, and you can compete against the market successfully with the right group around your table. So a startup is not a bad idea. That's how most of these happened 40 or 50 years ago, and it's still not a bad idea. Don't be afraid of a startup if you know exactly where you want to go and there's not an opportunity to buy. Many of you will go into associateships. About 25% of you right out of school statistically will enter into the market just as an employee, as an associateship, and that's fine. You can make some money, pay off some educational debt, hone your craft, and be prepared to move when you find that practice to enter and buy. So you can have an associateship that is leading to a buyout. A buyout means 100% purchase, or you can have an associateship leading to a partnership. And a partnership would be that you're going to work with one or more doctors in a group setting, and you guys are going to split the money and share it. You can be part of a solo group practice. This is not a new idea, but one we're seeing executed more and more. And this is, I have a friend that's a general dentist, a friend that's a pediatric dentist, and myself, and we're all going to Kansas City, and we're going to start a group practice. And essentially, you're going to operate as an orthodontic practice underneath a overhead management hood where you're all in one facility, and you have the facility built out to handle various dental specialties or general dental and ortho, something like that. You can be an employee of a corporate entity. Again, you're going to see a lot of corporate money flow into dentistry over the next decade, and there's many jobs available for you now that are corporate. You likely won't have an ownership stake, but these are good jobs for flexible schedules. If you only want to work 2 or 3 days a week, you can do that. Or if you just want to make some money, corporate orthodontic companies tend to pay higher per diems than solo practitioners or group practices do because there's no hope of ownership, but they like to keep you, so that's an opportunity. More and more, the pediatric dental orthodontist is working as an orthodontist inside a pediatric dental office. We normally, because we're solo focused on orthodontics, don't particularly care for this because it takes that referral base out of the community. But if you enter into one, we'd like for you to at least share in the facility, have some equity stake. with the pediatric dental practice. That would be our advice to you. The general dentist orthodontist, very similar. You're with a large group dental practice that wants to take orthodontics in-house. You're not going to gain the trust of a lot of other dental practices in that drawing area, but if you get with a large enough group, it's a very nice way to practice orthodontics, and you can be inside a large general dental practice and not have the worry that a lot of orthodontic owners have of catering to and receiving referrals from general dental practices. And lastly, the gypsy orthodontist is what is required in today's marketplace for a lot of orthodontists, and that is I'm going to work for several orthodontic entities, a day a week here, 2 days a week here, a day a week here, because I can't get a full-time opportunity someplace else. And so those are some of the opportunities. Some of you will go into academics. A handful of you will be dual trained in pedo-ortho or endo-ortho, something like that. But this is the landscape as we see it today. So I'm going to walk through this transition timeline. This is a timeline that we show sellers of orthodontic practices when we're talking about the transition process, and it's just as salient to residents and purchasers of orthodontic practices. And what you'll see is these bullets on the bottom of the timeline will have a moniker that comes up, but the first step is generally information gathering. If you're listening to this lecture, you're doing that right now. There's lots of places to get data on how practice transition works. There's a practice transition seminar that's hosted by the AAO the day before the annual session begins. It's an all-day event that's ticketed, and residents can go there for a decreased fee. There are numerous webinars and online learning opportunities like these G-Care webinar series and others that the AAO sponsors and so forth. But you likely will know more information about how to do this than the practice owner that you're talking to. And so in many instances, you as the younger orthodontist is actually a great resource about who to go to for this kind of information. Generally, a beginning step in the process, if you're going to enter into a practice that you're going to own equity in, is a practice valuation. And we'll talk a little bit about that later in this lecture, about what's involved in getting a practice valuation, what operational and financial information is needed, and how to determine the outcome of some of those things. But we'll talk about practice valuation. After a practice is valued, if I'm selling it, I have to find you. More importantly, right now, you have to find them. So we'll change that from find a buyer to find a seller. But somehow you need to meet a seller of equity of an orthodontic opportunity, and we'll talk about some ways to do that in this lecture. When the practice is valued and you found each other, what do? We've got to negotiate the financing. We've got to negotiate the asset allocation, which has to do with tax effect for both buyer and seller. We may have to negotiate pre- and post-associateship periods, leases, those kinds of things, and we'll discuss some of that. There's a part 2 of this series that we're going to give that's going to focus on the legal side and the cash flow pro forma side, so we won't get into that in great detail tonight, but certainly it's an important part of this process. Oftentimes there's an association period. This kind of icon of a couple dancing is a good picture of what this is meant to be. It's kind of a romance period where you get to enter the practice, make sure that your instincts were right and that this is the practice you want to purchase. Likewise, the seller gets to know you, and if it's a partnership, it's very important to work together for a period of time prior to buying into the practice. And so we'll talk about the ins and outs in the pay of associateship time periods. And lastly, we're finally going to have an attorney draft some legal documents, and ownership is going to be transferred. And you would think in this phase that there would be fireworks in the sky and lots of fanfare, but if it's done properly, it's kind of a non-event, and it's you and another doctor sitting at a table without an attorney present, signing a bunch of papers and then scanning and sending them to a lender and the people that are holding your documents. And so it's worth spending a minute on, how long does this process take? I've got a little arrow that I'll drag, but how long does it take to get from the information gathering, through the practice valuation, through finding each other, negotiate the deal, have an associateship period to a closing. And in most cases, the answer is 4 to 6 months. It takes plus or minus 90 days to accomplish a practice valuation, and then it can take, days, weeks, or years to find each other. So that's kind of a wild card in this timeline. After you found each other and you have the practice valued, it'll take a month to 2 months to kind of work through the details of the plan, and it'll take about a month for the attorneys to draft the documents and get those done. So generally it's a 4 to 6 month process. It's not one that can be rushed. And so if you're listening to this and you are graduating from your program in 90 days and you haven't found a practice, or you found a practice but it hasn't been valued yet, you're going to be pressed to get all the paperwork in line prior to you getting out of your program. So it's best to start early on this process and to move as quickly as possible. And as I mentioned, you can be a great resource to the sellers about how to get this done. So I'm going to take these one at a time, at least the first 4 or 5 bullets, and discuss them. And the first part of our timeline is information gathering, and what do you need to know. We think you need to take a look around at what's happening economically in the environment today. It's been an interesting last 5 years. We think you then need to take a closer look at what's happening in the practice around you. And so let's look at that briefly. This is a chart that shows every recession in the United States since the turn of the century. And it's fairly interesting. As an adult, I'm 51 years old. I've lived through 3 of these as an adult. But you'll see that the Great Depression is this big bar here. And then we've had several other recessions. And this last recession that we climbed out of, economists tell us, started in the 4th quarter of 2007 and ended in March of 2009. And the question on the title slide is, the recession is over, or is it? Reflects the fact that it doesn't feel like it's over economically for many orthodontic practice owners. And why is that? And I would submit to you that if you did much analysis of some of these recessions in earlier years, what you'll find is that the economy in the United States bounced out of these at a much faster clip than it is out of this most recent one. We saw gross domestic product growth and income growth at 3, 4, 5, 6% in a lot of these recessions that we came out of in the past, but we're not seeing that. Gross domestic product growth in 2008 was under 3%. It was under 3% again in 2009 and 2010 and 2011. We're currently in 2012, and it's projected to be just under 3%. We're seeing signs of life, but not great signs. But it's a tough economic environment, and that's what you need to understand from a large economic point of view, because it's affected the way consumers and business owners are acting. And I want to share this triangle with you and suggest to you that in any market, orthodontics just being an example, there's kind of a luxury brand, a mid-market brand, and a value brand. And that's true if we think about automobiles. We can think maybe Mercedes at the top. We can think of kind of Camry in the middle. We can think of kind of a Yugo or a Prius as a value brand. It's true in clothing manufacturers. You have the couture business at the top, or maybe Nordstrom's or something like that at the lower end of the high end. And then in the middle, you have places like Macy's, the Gap, Old Navy, those kinds of things. And in the value brand, places like Costco and even Walmart's and Kmart's. And watches, you kind of have Rolex, maybe Seiko, and maybe Timex or something like that. But so there's maybe one of the first big ideas to grasp of what we're going to go through today is that you need to think of your orthodontic market as segmented, and you need to understand where the practice that you own or the practice that you're going to buy is positioned within that market. And if we look at consumer activity, what we see right now is that in the luxury brand, we're seeing consumer spending, and everybody else is kind of shopping. and we're seeing a lot of second opinions in orthodontics. We're seeing a lot of down market shopping. We're seeing a lot of cost-conscious orthodontic buyers right now. That's how the consumer is acting. And so if you own a business in one of these sectors, how do you grow? If the economy is growing less than 3% and the consumers outside of the luxury market are shopping, business owners, in our opinion, are doing this. The business owners at the high end or the luxury brands are kind of offering products that are down market. The business owners in the value side are offering products that are up market, and that's putting a squeeze on the mid-market business owner, which is where most of the orthodontic practices in the country live, and we'll take a look at that in a minute. So there's this kind of squeeze. I mean, just as an example, if you think of Mercedes as a luxury brand car, if you look at the car that they're selling the most of, it's the C-Class or the kind of low-end Mercedes car that's outselling all other cars. If you look in the value business at people like really Microsoft, they're going up end into some more enterprise-wide types of software and things like that. And so business owners that are positioned at the high end and the low end are going down market or up market with their product offerings in order to grow in the current economic environment. It's important to understand that. So as we look at our market, the orthodontic market, you can kind of segment it about where you are. One way would be by case fee. And we know through the JCO practice studies that the median fee in the country is $5,100 for a full phase adolescent case. And we've seen Medicaid practices that operate quite successfully at $3,400 a case. And we've seen folks like Park Avenue Orthodontics or places like Chevy Chase or South Beach or places in California and in Pacific Palisades and other places at the very high end. And what we're seeing in orthodontics is the high-end boutique practices are doing quite nice, and the lower-end value-oriented practices, insurance-driven practices, are doing quite nice, and the mid-market is where we hear the loudest screams of pain. And as you'll see in the chart, that's where most of the orthodontists are, is in the mid-market. And I just kind of made these numbers up, but from my observation, I think we have about 15% of the practices kind of in this luxury high-end area, about 15% in this kind of more clinic insurance-oriented practice, and about 70% of the practicing orthodontists in the country are in this mid-market where it's really tough. And so the mid-market is smaller as a result. And I think you need to understand the practice and where it's positioned that you're looking into. An article that appeared in January of this year in the Wall Street Journal kind of points to this, and you may not be able to read this very clearly, but it basically says that the companies that traditionally catered to the middle class consumers suffered prior to 2012. Companies like Gap and JCPenney really got hammered. They're crawling back now as the economy tries to recover, but it's a difficult place to practice if you're in the mid-market, and that's the message that I want you to hear. So when you look at your market then as dentistry, I think this is an important chart to understand. I ask young orthodontists all the time, how many dentists are in the United States? How many of those are orthodontists? How many of those are other specialists? And very few people understand your market that well, but there's 161,000 dentists in the United States, plus or minus. This is data from the Department of Labor Statistics. About 135,000 practice as general dentist. And then you'll notice that you're the largest subspecialty in dentistry, and that's what we want to focus on in this lecture is the orthodontic market. And there's about 9,200 of you. And you're arrayed in the following way. This is information that was submitted to the ADA in a recent article by Chris Brannis, the executive director of the AAO. But about 69% of the orthodontists in the country operate as solo practitioners, and the next largest group is 16% that offer practices in partnerships. I want you to notice the great disparity in how few partnerships there are versus solo practitioners, and ask yourself why that might be true. And my observation in working with orthodontists for a number of years is that you're not, as a group, well wired to be partners. and I think this is 16% of you in partnerships reflects that. Partnerships offer a little bit different practice life than solo practitioners. You have a built-in coverage partner, that's great. You have a collaborative partner for cases, that's great. You generally have an upstroke in lifestyle as far as you may not work as many days, or it may be easier to get away from the practice. But generally it's true that you have a little bit of downstroke over the lifetime financially. There's a little bit of a trade-off for those benefits. You might not make as much income as a partner as you might as a practice owner, and decisions are having to be made collaboratively, and that's the biggest difference. Is there has to be a good chemistry if you're in a partnership. You have to understand what you're good at, what you're not good at, what your partner's good at, what your partner's not good at, and divide the workflow and responsibilities accordingly. 6% of you are in associateships. Translate the word associateships to employees. Many of you will start out that way. Interdisciplinary practice is about 5 or 6%, and large corporate practices are a growing number where you're working for a corporation. But this is a graph that just shows how you're arrayed as a specialty currently. So what's the market like for buyers and sellers? This is a graph that doesn't represent all buyers or all sellers, but what you'll see is this is data from the AAO Practice Opportunities website, and this goes from October of 2008 to August of 2012. And what you'll see is the number of sellers that have registered with this website to sell their practice and try to find a buyer versus the number of buyers. And what jumps off the page is there's about 3 times more buyers. It was tougher during the recession in these years, but right now we kind of see a 3-to-1 ratio of buyers to sellers. So we understand it's difficult for you. That's why you have to start early, and we'll talk about some things that you can do to help find a practice. So that's kind of some global information for you on where the market is and some things that you need to consider. Let's now move to practice valuation and how do you look at evaluation. Because it's something we do, we're asked all the time, what's the average practice go for? And this is data from our company from 2006 through 2011. We'll compile this again in a month or so when the year's ended. But what you'll see here is that the collections of the practices that we see are reflected in this column. The adjusted overhead rates are reflected in this column. I'll talk more about what adjusted means, but this is what it really costs to produce the revenue on the left-hand column. And this leaves practice income for the owner in this column, and practice values that we've determined in this column here, with the average being in recent years around 75%. Now, what I don't want any of you to do is to call me and look at a deal and say, Chris, I found a practice, it's doing $1 million and it's valued at $750,000. I heard your lecture and that must be a great deal because it's right where you said it would be. These are averages, and so that means there's a big sway in the lowest to the highest, and these can be as low as 50% to as high as 95%. And we'll talk about some things later on that make that go to one end or the other. So it wouldn't at all be a bad transaction to pay $900,000 for a practice that was doing $1 million in collections under certain circumstances. And it wouldn't be wise for you to spend $750,000 on $1 million practice when it should be valued lower because of certain circumstances. And we'll talk about what those are. So what information do we need to gather when we do evaluation? There are 2 primary types of information. The first is operational, and we're going to take a look at that here. And the next is financial, and we'll take a look at that in a minute. But from an operations point of view, most valuators of orthodontic transactions will look at the last 3 years of operational data. And we'll look at the number of days the doctors worked. We'll look at the production, and we'll look at the collections. And we would love to see production exceeding collections every year because that would indicate the practice is growing. So one concept that you need to grasp is that the amount of money that the practice produces this year will likely reflect or closely reflect the amount that the practice will collect next year. So if you buy a practice that collected $1 million this year and it produced $1,100,000, that practice is growing and would be likely that you would collect more than $1 million next year. Conversely, if you buy a practice that produced $1 million this year but only produced $900,000 orthodontic work, that practice is on the decline and it might not value as high. So you need to understand the relationship between those two numbers. Another key metric is the contracts receivable balance. It's shown here as $600,000 and change on collections of $1 million or so. And that's a great number. But this number reflects what's left to be billed out in contracts for existing active patients. Another way to state this is if I never start another patient, what's left to be collected. And we want to understand that number because it's important to the purchaser. New patient flow is very important. We want to understand how many new patients came into the practice. Is that number declining or increasing? Of that number, how many are we starting? And so we want to know how many starts we have. We'd like to know how many active patients we have. How many of those active patients have a zero balance? There's a lot of information that we want to collect. And the question is, where do we get it? And it comes off the practice management system, and that's where we gather most of that information. So let's look quickly at some key metrics that are published in the JCO every year. The JCO does a biannual practice study. The last one was published in 2011. The far right column shows the results of that. And what you'll see is that we're an aging profession in orthodontics. The median age, these are all medians, the median age of an orthodontist in the United States today is 54 years old and been practicing 23 years. And the median collections for a solo-owned practice in the United States right now is $950,000, okay? What you'll notice as you read through the line, the far left column is 1983, and it shows various time points along that line, but you'll see that from 2009 to 2011 is the first time in the 30 years that the JCO has been doing this study, the practice collections actually declined from $960,000 to $950,000. It's just another indicator that it's difficult in the market today. Along with that decline in collections, we see an increase in overhead, and so it's getting more expensive. Many orthodontic owners that have been practicing for 23 years, that are 54 years old, find it very unappetizing to dilute or eliminate staff members. And so most practices that we see, we think are overstaffed by a full-time equivalent or so. And so that drives expenses up. Technology is very expensive. 30 years ago, you bought a $20,000 pan-ceph machine if you were really extravagant, and that machine was film-based, and it lasted for 25 or 30 years. Right now, we can buy digital machines in the $70,000 to $80,000 range. We can buy cone beam machines in the $180,000 to $200,000 range, and we might switch those out every 7 years as the technology changes. So it's much more expensive today on the technology side to run an orthodontic practice, and we're seeing that reflected as well as an occupancy cost. The median case starts in a practice are 200 today. They used to be 220. Again, this number is going down. It's tougher to find patients. The adult patient population is currently about 20% in the median practice. We think it's an opportunity and an area for growth in many practices. And the median number of active patients currently is 450. So if I'm starting 200 cases a year and I'm finishing people in about 24 months, it would make sense that I have about 400 active cases, okay, 2 years worth of cases, plus the ones that don't quite finish up on time. So 450 would be a fair number here. If you tell me, Chris, I'm buying a practice that's starting 200 active patients a year, it's doing $950,000, and it's got 700 active patients, I would tell you that we're having a difficult time getting those patients finished up and out the door, and you're going to have a lot of patients that are going to take up chair time whose contracts have been fully billed out, and that might necessitate a haircut on the purchase price, okay? So that's a number that we want to understand. As far as fees are concerned, the median case fee is $5,200 for a full-phase adolescent case, $5,550 for a full-phase adult case. We think adults ask more questions, take more chair time, are more complicated and complex cases, and that you should legitimately charge more for an adult case, and can and should. 2-year fee increases averaged 3% in the recent study, and if you look back here and see these larger numbers of 15.5 and 10 and 10 and 8, you ask the question, why were they so much higher back then than they are now? A couple of answers to the question. These largely trail the economy. So we had times when the economy was growing. They're also indexed to inflation, fee increases are. And so we have a time right now of very low growth and very low inflation. And I would suggest to you that it's been that way for a long time. But hear this, we want you as a general practice to raise your fees every year. Even if it's just 1.5% or 2%. Or whatever. A lot of young doctors feel like, I don't want to raise my fees because people won't come see me, and there's no empirical evidence in any study or with any of the consultants that study such matters that indicates that there's any truth to that. So raise your fees every year. You're probably going to be looking at some inflation with as much money as the country's borrowed in your practice lifetime the next 10 years. You're probably going to be looking at your wages increase, your occupancy increase. I've never seen a lease that didn't have a 2 or 3% increase year over year. So it's going to cost you more to produce the $950,000 next year than it does this year. And one way to mitigate that as an owner is to raise your fees annually. And we think you should be in a practice of doing that. Payment periods have gone from a traditional 24 months to less than that. I think there's enough agreement. There's some technology out there in orthodontics that's further reducing treatment time under some treatment modalities, and that causes a great discussion about is it more valuable to the consumer to get in and out of a full face case sooner versus later. And I think most consumers would say yes, that's more valuable, but in today's economic environment will say no, I don't want to pay for it. And so as treatment times continue to decrease, which I suspect they will in your career, you'll have to decide how your fees are going to float with that decrease in time. Assignment of benefits, about 80% of practices accept assignment of benefit. That does not mean that they take insurance. That does not mean, as far as a PPO or a fixed fee plan, it does not mean they're a Medicaid practice. It means they process the paperwork, and the payment for the insurance portion comes to the practice. And we would suggest that this is an area that many practices can improve their processes in. Most do it very inefficiently. And all the practice management systems that are available do it quite nicely. And the average patient seen per day is 45. There's many practices that see greater than 100, but this again is the median range, and that's kind of the pace at which you'll be working. So hopefully this will give you some benchmarks to look at the practice that you're looking at and compare it to where the medians are in the country. Again, where does all this data live? It lives on your practice management system. Some of the top practice management systems out there have agreed to write instructions for us. I know that IMS from GAC is in the process of writing some instructions for us as well. And this is just a set of instructions that helps get the data off of the practice management system that we need to value a practice. So that's where that data lives, and that's largely the operational piece. Let's talk now about the financial data that we need. And I know you can't read these numbers, but I just wanted to give you some visual examples of what a profit and loss statement looks like, and to talk for a minute about what a profit and loss statement means. Historically, if you just think about the definition of a profit and loss statement, and most of these are being done by Quicken or QuickBooks in orthodontic practices today, it should reflect how much money the practice collects, which in this instance, you would see that in the upper left-hand corner. There's collections right here, and then everything underneath that is where the practice spends money. And these are all these items here. And we're going to break these down for you in a simpler format in a minute. But at the end, this bottom line should represent the economic benefit that comes to the owner of this practice for taking the risk of ownership. And I would submit to you that there are various styles and flavors of profit and loss statements, but almost none of them reflect what it truly, the economic benefit is to the owner, because under the current tax codes, you can run as doctor income quite a few things through the practice. Things like cars, things like cell phones, things like your payroll taxes for the doctor, things like your retirement planning for the doctor, things like your dry cleaning, things like the roll of paper towel that you bought at Costco, and most of it showed up in the office, but some of it showed up at home. What we do in the valuation process, next few slides are just other visual examples of what profit and loss statements look like, is we have a form that looks like this. In that middle highlighted column is where we try to take out the things that are really doctor compensation but are reflected as expenses in the profit and loss statement, and then determine what the true operating expenses are to produce the revenue that the practice is doing. And in our experience right now, this is reflective of a very efficiently run practice. And I'm going to take a minute to walk through some of these charts and show you that the staff expenses are generally about 25% of all the revenue. This is where your biggest investment will be made. Orthodontic supplies and lab expenses run about 11%, business management about 9%, and occupancy, which is your building, janitorial, snow removal, utilities and things like that, are running just under 10%, for a total of 55% of overhead, which again is an efficient practice in today's world, which means that you get to keep 45% of every dollar that you collect. And so if we walk through the breakdown, this is one slide for each of those 4 categories. And again, your W-2 wages are about 20.7%. This is not for the doctor, but just for the staff. And an area where we see a lot of discussion right now is in health insurance and so forth. You need to become familiar with the term HSA, Healthcare Savings Account. It's a place where you can still offer a healthcare benefit and make it affordable, and it's great for high-income earners like doctors. In the orthodontic lab and supplies, a standard straight wire practice with an innovation product or something like that is going to spend about 8.4% for brackets. And if you're not doing heavy Invisalign or anything like that, about 2.5% for lab, with a total of around 11% for orthodontic supplies and lab. If I see this at 14 or 15%, I think Sure Smile, I think heavy Invisalign, I think Damon, things like that. And so that's okay if those are higher, but we want to understand why. On the business management expenses, it's a potpourri of a lot of items, and this is an area where if you can dial down 0.1% here or there, it can be meaningful to you. And but you should be spending around 9%. One comment on marketing up here is called advertising and promotions. The average practice is spending 2.4% of collections on marketing. I've seen practices spend as much as 7%. I've seen them spend as little as 0%. But in today's competitive market, as a young orthodontist, you're going to spend some money here. It's an area where you can spend a lot of money for no return, or some money for greater return. And we're finding practices that are growing are focusing on internal marketing with heavy leverage on social media. And that's not a topic for this webinar, but just an area to point out. Occupancy expenses, again, this is the lease or the mortgage on your building. As a general rule of thumb, if you're going to buy a piece of land and put a building up, we do not want you to spend more than 70% for the land and building costs of annual collections. That means if you've got a $1 million practice, we don't want you to spend more than $700,000 to buy the land and put the building up. And that's just a rule of thumb that will help keep occupancy expense in line with overhead. I think smaller footprints and more efficient use of space are in store for most orthodontists going forward. So what are the factors that we need to think about when we do evaluation besides profitability, which is the key one? This is how much money, you know, what your expenses are and how much you get to keep. We just saw that you got to keep 45% in the examples that we just looked at. But we want to look at the condition of the office. Is it super old? What's the equipment like? What's the practice management system like? We want to look at certain operational metrics that we've touched on. Contract receivable balance, how many are paid in full? That's what PIF stands for. We want to see where the location is vis-a-vis the schools, vis-a-vis the competitors, vis-a-vis where the town is growing, which direction it's growing. You may buy a practice that was in the greatest part of town 20 years ago, but everything is growing on the northern part of town now. So you might want to consider a satellite office there. We want to see where the competition is. We want to evaluate the staff. They're a huge asset, what the current referral patterns are, and the demand for orthodontic services are, and that's a demographic study. So those are things that go into the practice valuation. Where we talk about finding a buyer, they need to find you, but you need to find them. And how do you do that? And I want to share some data that you've given us as residents over the last years. We do an annual resident survey, and this is data from 10, 11, and 12. And we ask you as residents, when you get out of your program, what do you want to do? And in large numbers, you said, I want to purchase a practice, about half of you. 25% roughly say you want to work as an employee when you get out, 11% startup, academics, 4% military, and others. But that's kind of what you're telling us are your goals. And we ask if you found a practice, and again, in large numbers, you said you have not. And that makes sense because it's hard to find a practice right now. We ask how much educational debt you're going to have, and this is a scary thing and a trend that we're watching closely. If you look at 300 to 400,000 in debt, that's gone from 20% to 14%, and it's kind of just rolled over into this greater than 400,000 column here. We're currently in 2012, you said 20% of you told us you were going to have more than $400,000 in educational debt. When you do the math on it, it looks like this. You get to get out of your program, you get 6 months of kind of a reprieve from your educational lenders to get started, and then you start making payments. And if you have $400,000 in school debt, you're roughly looking at $3,600 a month, most of that post-tax. And so the first $50,000 plus or minus that you make as an orthodontist, whether it's as an employer or an owner, is going to go service your educational debt. So if you're out here in these far right columns, you cannot afford to buy a $400,000 practice that's a fixer-upper and grow it to $1 million, $1.2 million. You've got to think bigger, even though that means a higher acquisition price. It'll have a higher cash flow to meet your cash flow needs. This is just a picture of a recent resident that we worked with that had $400,000 in debt, bought that $1 million practice, got 100% financing for it, so there is money available for you. And how do you find the practices? Companies like ours have databases. We already talked about the Orthodontic Practice Opportunities site, but you can find a practice. And then how do you present yourself to a practice? Each of you have a CV. It looks something like this on the first page. It's a page or two of information that tells us that you're very smart and very accomplished. And we would suggest that it's a relationship-oriented business and that you should include a cover letter or a paragraph like this that shows a picture and describes the triggering event that caused you to want to go to school for 28 or 29 years and become an orthodontist and have this amount of educational debt. You each have a story to tell. We think you should tell it. We think you should show a picture, and we think that helps you get into a practice or into an employment opportunity. Don't make it short or too short. Don't show a picture that's not appropriate. A few tips on photos is include your hobbies and interests. Include your memorable events, include things that you like to do outside of orthodontics. Some things to avoid, self-portraits aren't so great. You can't see real clearly what the story is. Don't send a blurry picture. Make sure you get a nice crisp picture that's free of distractions. Not that the baby is a distraction. We want you to show your kids, but do your best to show off your family appropriately. We asked where you wanted to practice, and this is a heat map of the United States with the red areas being the hot areas and the cooler colors being the less interesting areas to residents. And it's no surprise that it follows largely the population areas in the United States. If you look at the top 10 states that were preferred by residents over the last many years that we've done this study, what you'll find is it's really the same states reorganized in a different manner. You'll see California and Texas are the number 1 or 2 state pretty traditionally over time, and the rest of the states are generally represented but in a different order. And so these are highly competitive states orthodontically. If you look at the other end of the spectrum where very few orthodontic residents want to go, we think if you're open geographically that these are places that you might want to consider more strongly. The competition's less intense. The practice lifestyle is great. They tend to be bigger practices with lower overhead with patients that are willing to drive 30 or 40 or 50 minutes to come see you. And so this is just some data that might be interesting if you're open geographically. So we print a lot of the information that you just saw in our newsletter. We think it's a great resource. Some of you have received this gratis during your program. Hopefully you've seen it. It's something we hope you would consider. And through GAC's buying group, the UOBGC, it's offered as a discount to you, and we hope you would consider receiving information like we just shared for you. So this is the first part of how to find and locate a practice. The next lecture in this series will focus on contracts, on tax asset allocation, on more the nuts and bolts of the transaction. But I thank you for listening. You're entering into what we consider the best profession in the world. It's a little bit different now, so you have to be a little bit sharper with your pencil, but there's great opportunities. If you start early, you'll all find great opportunities. Don't be afraid to start up. Surround yourself with great people like we went over at the beginning, and I wish you well as you launch your career.